Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, the show about and for writers and those looking to learn something about the experience of writing and publishing here in the modern age. For those who don't know, this show is available by the same name on both YouTube and via all of the major podcast platforms, and you can subscribe to either or both, which is my recommendation, so you never miss a thing. My guest today is the author of two really cool thriller series, the Jordan Stone thrillers, and her latest creation, the Nico Moretti thrillers. I had the pleasure of getting to know her a bit at a recent writers' conference, and I can say that not only is she a great writer, she's also very fun and very supportive person to be around. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Karen Dodd to the Open Mic. Good morning, Karen, and thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
Good morning. It's lovely to see you again, and thank you for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. Well, for somebody who might not have discovered your work yet, let me start there. Tell us a little bit about these two thriller series that I mentioned in the intro.
Okay, well, the first, I guess the Stones series came out in, I think it was late 2013, and for some reason, I was just obsessed with Italy, although I had not been there, to the setting where the first book took place. And it was in a little town called Tropea in southern Italy, in Calabria. But we had a very good friend, our lawyer, his family was from there, and he would go back every year and we'd have lunch and he'd show me the pictures. And after a while, I felt like I'd been there. So it just seemed like a natural place to set the first book. And the thing that I love, I should just backtrack a bit. It did start in Vancouver, which is where I live now, on the outskirts of Vancouver, and then went over to Italy. And so there was that Canadian Italy connection. And then at one point, it even kind of went to Carmel in California, a place that we love. So it gave me it gave me an opportunity to play. And the most satisfying thing with that one for me, Rich, was that people said, "Oh, we know that you live there. Like, you totally know that area, the smells, the sound, the area." And the truth was, I didn't get there until a year after the book came out. And so it was fun, but it was not heavy on the Italian mafia, but there is that influence there. And I would say that one was more of a romantic suspense, again, kind of light on the romance, but that was the beginning of the series. Yeah.
And then now you're doing the Nico Moretti series.
And now the Nico Moretti series, and that started in Malta, the first book in that series, everybody knows. And the second book, which is in the writing revision stage now, is back in Calabria, Italy again. So,
Well, I think we talked about this when we were in Tucson earlier this year, but I'm fascinated when I talk to writers because setting is such a important part, especially of thrillers. It seems to be very, very important to thrillers and mysteries. And I was really kind of taken back by a writer I talked to recently who told me, because his work was set in the very most remote parts of Alaska, and I just assumed he had been there. And of course, when I talked to him, he said, "No, I've never been there yet. I did through Google Maps and reading about it and that kind of thing." So I said, "Wow, okay, that's pretty cool."
yeah.
Sounds like you did something similar in your first book. Tell us a little bit about your research and how you got someone to think, "Gosh, you must have lived there. You really have this down so well." Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts about setting and how you essentially make it into a character unto itself in your books.
Yeah, I do. I'm glad you said that, because when you moderated our wonderful panel in Tucson, I think I was on there for the setting aspect. For me, it's not just a place to set the story. I think the setting really informs everything. The characters, the plot, everything for me. And so because I had not been to Italy, I've since been about 5 times on research trips since then, but because I hadn't, Google Maps was amazing. Having a friend in that that personal contact. I could check things. But it was really that Google Map and being able to zero in, so that when I was actually in Tropea, like I said, I think it was about a year and a bit after the book came out, every nook and cranny and cobblestone road and lane was exactly as I had pictured it and described it in the book. Because I thought, oh no, what if I get there and it's completely different? The good news is my books are not translated into Italian, so the people who live there wouldn't know if I offended them. But yeah, so I do a lot of research that way. But since then, and prior to COVID, I was able to travel to Malta, travel another 3 or 4 times to Italy.
Well, and I think it's such an important thing to do, to not let your ambition to write a book set in a particular place be compromised by something like that. As you say, during COVID, we couldn't travel, right? So if you felt like the only way you could do something was to have gone there, then that project would have died in its infancy. So, and I remember years ago being at a conference and talking to somebody who was wanting to write, I think it was an FBI thriller. In fact, I know it was, because he said, well, the thing that was holding him up is he had not been able to figure out a way to get into Quantico so he could accurately describe it. And I remember thinking then, well, why does it matter? No one gets into Quantico. We're not going to know if it's, you got some details wrong. Write the damn story, right? So yeah. I admire the use of modern tools to make it as accurate as you can, but not letting anything like that stop you from doing the thing you want to do. And I want to follow up too, because the Nico Moretti series, as you noted, is in Malta, and there's organized crime. There's lots of stuff going on there. Did you do any particular research for that?
So the story with that, and I think I mentioned it in Tucson, but for your listeners now, there is a very well-known journalist who was assassinated in Malta, Daphne Galizia, Caruana Galizia. And I've been in Malta about 6 months after her assassination, but I had no knowledge of it. It wasn't on my consciousness at all. And it was so interesting because you didn't see any presence, you didn't hear anything about it. And then when I came back to Canada, I learned what had really happened with her. She was assassinated in a car bomb, literally just feet down the country road from her family home. And one of her grown sons heard it and went running down the road in bare feet. And so that was really the impetus for that story, that I happened to have been in Malta. Most of my plots are kind of ripped from the headlines, and but because I was in touch with her grown sons on social media, I didn't want to take any liberties. It took years for them to get justice. There's so much, as you said, so much corruption in that area. So I fictionalized, instead of it being a journalist, it was Nico Moretti is the male protagonist, and the woman who was assassinated was, in my story, fictionalized as an anti-corruption prosecutor, rather than being too close to the bone.
Right. Well, yeah. And let's talk about plotting, because your books are known for having intricate plots, a lot of twists, a lot of turns, and which is great. But I still always wonder, what comes first for you? Is it characters or the plot? Do you think of a plot and then you create the characters to populate that story, or you generally have a character in mind that you want to create a story for?
That's a great question, and it's really easy for me to answer, because after the impetus for the story comes usually from something in the headlines. It's definitely then the setting and the plot. The characters will come after I figured out what the plot needs to be. I kind of wish it was the other way around, but I've just never gotten attached to a character and thought, oh, I've got to write this story around he or she. It's always been the plot is big for me, and then bringing the characters just kind of spring to life. I mean, I don't, I'm not consciously inventing them. They just kind of come when you start writing.
Based on, essentially the story you're trying to tell.
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
based on the story you're trying to tell, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, Nico Moretti was a complete surprise. I had no plan to write from a male protagonist point of view. None. And I was like, how did that happen? So then I had to get a little bit of not sensitivity readers, but just enough input from men to, is this authentic?
Well, it's interesting to me, and this always comes across, I feel like name dropping, and I don't mean it to be, but I had the fortune of having Jess Walter on one time when we were talking about his great book, The Beautiful Ruins, which is one of my favorite books ever. And I asked him, how long did it take him to write the book? And he told me 13 years. And from the time that it started to to the end was 13 years, but virtually every character changed. The main character went from being a man to a woman. The setting changed. Everything changed, right? But
Yeah.
the basic story that he had in his head was the thing that was the driver, right? So yes, all those characters and even the settings were all somewhat fungible. The story was not, and that's what was the driver on that. And that's why it took him so long, right? I think he probably wrote 5 books in between too, if I'm, But anyway, I'm always interested in that because I think that's one of the great challenges for writers is to, when you're creating something out of whole cloth. Okay, well, what part of it is that driver for you? What's the thing is it the character? Is it the story? Is it something else? Right. So,
Right. And it's different with all writers. I mean, I always know the beginning and the end of the story, but there's certainly room for it to come organically. And I have to actually make sure I don't get into too many subplots, because that's where I can easily go crazy and paint myself into a corner. I'm not an outliner per se, so yeah.
That was going to be a question I wanted to ask you. What's the most challenging part of laying down plots for you? Is there one aspect of putting together a plot that you struggle with more than others?
Probably the fact that I am a discovery writer versus an outliner. I think we all, those of us who, were called pantsters, I prefer to call myself a discovery writer.
I like that. I hadn't heard that term before. So yeah, it's a lot easier to say than a pantser too. I struggle with that.
Yeah, I don't like pantser, but that probably is the most challenging, because I think all of us who do write more organically, you do tend to overwrite, and you can't use everything, and then you sort of have to pull yourself back in, or you've written yourself into a corner. And I used to beat myself up over that. And, now recently I listened to so many podcasts, including yours. And I love hearing from other writers who say, you know what, it's messy, but it works for me. It probably takes longer. I probably lose some words. Oh, excuse me. My say hello, Bello.
I love that. That's great.
Yeah, so that's probably the most difficult. I have to be honest. I have found that through COVID, I wrote and published one book and got the first draft of another book done during COVID. That was tricky. I just found that the intricacy of the plotting during that time, was challenging for sure.
Do you find that you ever have the same issue with characters, where you really struggle to formulate the character in the way that you want, or to make them multidimensional, or what is your experience there for you? What's your biggest challenge there for you?
Yes, to all of the above. I don't find setting challenging at all, to be able to breathe life into that place and that sense of that atmospheric, because you say it's so important, I think, in thrillers and suspense. But I struggle still after being, writing for more than a decade, I still struggle to make those characters multidimensional and to breathe life into them. And I've probably had about 4 editors in my writing career, and each one has always said, you're skating along the surface here, you need to get deeper. So it's something I'm really aware of, but it's still a challenge because characters make the story. It's huge.
Well, I want to ask you about a specific character because I was reading some reviews of one of the Jordan Stone books, and some of the reviewers, mostly, were very, very complimentary, but the complaint that I saw from a few was that they found Jordan Stone somewhat unlikable.
Yes.
And it really made me think, well, does it matter to have a likable protagonist, number one? And then the other part of that, is there maybe just a hint of sexism there in that we demand that women be likable in a way that we don't require of men? I feel like men can be anti-heroes and like, I present to you, my friends, Clint Eastwood. One of the most unlikable people in the world on so many levels, right? But in his characters in a lot of ways, but people love him, right? Is that even possible for a woman? And so that's a multi-part question there. Does it matter that you have a likable protagonist, and does it matter for a woman to be a likable protagonist?
That's actually some really great thoughts, some great comments. So I do read my reviews because that's how I learn from them. I think in particular with Jordan, I'm not sure that it was necessarily a sexist thing. The reviews that went along, that book continues to get good reviews after all these years. It amazes me. But I think it was more they wanted to slap her sometimes. Like, it was sort of like, don't go into that room. Like, you've already done this. Don't be so stupid. I took it more that way, Rich, than that, sexist thing. But I hadn't thought of it. So your comments are really enlightening. But I think that's why some writers, a lot of writers, do not read their reviews. I definitely do, because that's where I learn where I can improve. To answer your question about whether a protagonist needs to be likable, and we heard this a lot at the Tucson Left Coast Crime Conference, I think it's more important that they can be relatable, but not necessarily likable. And so I think that, that's a fine line that we can maneuver.
Well, and like I say, I think the anti-hero is a classic icon across all literature, right?
Right.
I struggle to think of any form of literature that doesn't have at least one anti-hero somewhere in it. I'm sure there is, but I'm hardly an expert. But it's such an iconic figure, right? The anti-hero. But yes, it's true. I think there has to be something there that people care. I think relatable is the exact right thing, because people have to care about what happens. That's the death knell for me as a reader. When I read something and I don't care what happens to somebody, the moment I'm cognizant of the fact that I don't care what happens to them, I may not like what they're doing. I may be like that, like your readers were like, "Don't go in there. What's wrong with you? That's crazy." But the minute I don't care what happens to them going into that space,
that's the death knell.
then you're done, right? Then you're done.
Yeah.
I want to backtrack just for 1 second here, because we're talking about outlining and pantsing and or discovery writing. When did you discover that just starting down and writing and discovering as you went was the best thing for you? Did you try both? Was there, did you have to, trial and error, and then was it always just a natural way for you to go about doing these things?
Yeah, it was. I think sometimes with your debut book, which the Jordan Stone, the first one was Deadly Switch, I didn't know any better. So I had this idea for a story. I knew the beginning, I knew the end. And I've written all my life, but it was more nonfiction, entrepreneurial, business type articles, communication skills, stuff like that. And so I just sat down, and I still to this day feel like I just channeled it. So it never occurred to me that I guess maybe I should have thought about outlining it. And I mean, I always invest in multiple editors. I always have from day one. Just even when I didn't even know what I didn't know, I just knew cover design and good editors. And so I guess I relied on, I didn't consciously as I was writing it, but they sure helped me fix and tighten up all of my books, all of my stories.
Yeah, and I'm excuse me, I'm really glad you brought up editors, and because I use good editor too, and I think investment is the right word.
They're worth their weight in gold.
They really are, and they're really worth your time to find one that works with you, works for you, understands what it is you're trying to do. I've had good experiences myself. I've known most people that have had really good experiences, but I've known some folks who had bad experiences with editors. And sometimes I think there's communication issues. What has been for you in working with editors? What are the biggest lessons you've learned from working with editors, both good and bad?
For me personally, it's don't send too early. I mean, we all know we want our draft to be as polished as possible before we send it to an editor. For one thing, we get our money's worth a lot better if we do that. But I certainly learned not to send what I thought was a polished draft too early. Sit on it for a while, give it at least a couple of weeks, if not a month, if you can. That's often tough because I have self-imposed deadlines. I have not had bad experiences from editors, from any of them, but I did with Everybody Knows, the first Nico Moretti book that you were referring to. I had a full developmental, actually, I should say, I had a copy edit done on that book first, on that draft. And I ended up being referred to an amazing editor in the UK, Rebecca Miller, by several other UK authors that I knew personally. So I think that's a big tip, like try and go with somebody that's referred to you and make sure it's the right fit. And I had her do a full, like a complete developmental edit after I'd already had that book copy edited. So she did a full developmental edit. I did all those revisions. And then I had another copy edit and proofread done. And I think she was almost more, Rebecca was, I think any good editor can be almost a book coach for you.
Mm-hmm.
They all work differently in their editorial style. And I try to respect her time and not abuse that, but I learned so much. It made that book so much better, so much tighter. And I used her on the next book that is not out in that series yet.
Well, I like to think that I have made every mistake a writer could possibly make. And the one that comes to mind the most is the one you just mentioned, which is submitting something too early, whether it's to an editor or querying an agent. Oh my God. I think everybody who does this, I feel like has probably done that at some point. And, I was just talking with my wife about this. There's times the industry is so hard these days. If you're trying to go the traditional route and get an agent and, go through get a big five publishing deal. I mean, it really is. I describe it as, you're trying to hit a moving target from 500 yards with a blow dart. And I mean, it's just really hard because, and a lot of times the thing that gets your work rejected has nothing to do with the quality of the work. It might have everything to do with timing or bad fit, or maybe they've spent all their money on somebody else already, or whatever the case may be, right? There's lots of things. Mm-hmm. But it all adds up to rejection. And it is so humbling and sometimes even disheartening. How do you handle rejection? How do you deal with it when things just are not going your way and you really start to question yourself? does that happen to you, first of all? And the second thing is, how do you handle it?
Well, I did things maybe a little backward. I had decided a decade ago that I was already at that certain age that I wasn't going to go through all of the querying and reject. I thought at that time, I remember saying to a couple of critique partners, well, I could collect rejections for the next 3 to 5 years, or I could get 3 to 5 books out. So that's what I did. I went the independent publishing route right away, but invested very heavily in making sure that those books could stand spine to spine in a library or a bookshop with a traditionally published. Now, more than a decade later, I actually have made the decision to query the book that I'm currently writing. It was to be the second in the Nico Moretti series, and that book is written, and it's the revisions are sitting in a drawer, and I'm writing a book actually based on the small seaside village that I live in here. Not a cozy by any means, but a suspense thriller. And so I am about to start on that rejection road, and I fully anticipate that could go on for a long time. And I think you just have to, I think when you can, give yourself a break, like literally take a break from the writing, surrounding yourself by other authors. I formed a group. We call ourselves a creative coven now, but we were a mastermind of 5. We are now 6 published authors, multi-published, and we keep each other from, saying my writing's crap, I'm crap, the world is crap, everything's crap, and it's a combination of independent. We've got independently published authors, traditional with Simon & Schuster, and hybrid, and it really helps keep me balanced. That helps a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's great because I think the one thing that every writer could agree with is that this is such a solitary profession, right? You have your butt in your chair doing your work is how things get done, regardless of what happens on the other side of that, whether it's traditional or independent or some, hybrid form of that. But you have to keep finding a way to push yourself forward. And the other thing I think is there's rarely, in my experience, anyone that's a harsher critic on us than we are on ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
That said, I think there's a lot to be said for you really need to find a group of people that you can trust and you can work with and you can share critiques with in a way that's amenable to everybody getting the most out of them. I've known authors who were in critique groups that they had to get away from because the critiques were from anything from kind of harsh to just downright mean, or just
or just not helpful.
Not helpful.
Not productive.
Like the kind of thing. Yeah, look, we all know our mom loves us, right? But we don't need mom critiquing our work, right? Because we all know mom's going to love our work, right? So you got to find something that. So how did you find all these people? You mentioned it sounds like you have a great group, but how did you put folks together? Did you was there a gauntlet for them to go through to join the group?
No. And I'm glad you mentioned the critique thing, because I think a critique group is very different to me than a mastermind group or however you would want to term that support group. So we do occasionally, I could send a piece off to one of our mastermind members, our creative coven members, but we're not actually per se a critique group as much as we talk about craft and marketing and publishing and rejection and all of those things. But when I started, Rich, with Deadly Switch, that book, I was a member of a critique group. We started out with 5 of us and we ended up with 3, and we went for about 6 years together. And 2 out of the 3 of us were published, multi-published. The other gal is not. She's a great writer. Whether she'll ever publish or not, I don't know. But I think I got to a point with that critique group where it was exactly as you said. And it was never mean, but it got to a point where it wasn't necessarily productive. And so I think you have to, as we learn and we rise in our profession, we need to sort of have some people coming along with us. I may not be articulating that very well, but now with the Creative Coven, our mastermind group, I feel very definitely that all those women, and we're different genres. We're not all suspense thrillers. They bring me up.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can do different things for each other. And the marketing is a big part of it, because even our traditionally published members of that group are still responsible for doing a lot of their own promotion and marketing.
That is another one of those secrets that I think folks who are not, immersed in the publishing world right now, might think. I shouldn't say anything definitively, but I think for a long time people thought, I write a book, I get an agent, I get a deal, I'm doing signings, and I'm going on the radio and the Today Show, and I'm all these things. And sure, there are definitely people for whom that is a reality, but the 99.999% of us, that's not ever going to happen. And even if, as you noted, if you get a traditional publishing deal, you're still, unless your name is Stephen King or something like that, you're not going to get much marketing help, even from Simon and Schuster. You are really going to have to do a ton in fact, and especially if you're doing nonfiction, you better be able to show them directly all the ways that you are going to be able to market the book on your own before they'll, a lot of times, move forward. I mean, some of that, there's platform and all those things, that nonfiction is extraordinarily different from fiction. So I want to be very clear what I'm talking about here. But if you're writing fiction, you better be planning to work on your own marketing. That is how it's going to be.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, in fact, I believe you had recently on one of your podcasts that I listened to, an editor who's now an agent. And actually, she also said one of her pet peeves is authors sending in their manuscripts prematurely, what we were talking about before. But also that it's not necessarily for fiction writers, the social media platform size isn't as important as, that the agent and the publisher knows you're at least willing to get out there and be engaged, right? You might not have 10,000 followers or 250,000 followers, but if you're a mid-list author, you're not a celebrity or a Stephen King, as you said, or John Grisham, or, we all have to do that. It would be nice to just finish that book and start writing the next one and not worry about it, but that's not the reality anymore.
Right.
Hasn't been for a long time.
Right, absolutely. What's the biggest challenge that you feel you've had to overcome in your writing career?
The biggest challenge? Oh my gosh. Probably mindset, because you're so right. It's such a solitary profession. I love that part of it, actually, because I am quite introverted, but I think if you don't push yourself out there and have some kind of support network, that is a challenge, because then when I mean, it never fails when I get my huge editorial letter and all the track changes back from my editor, I just go,
yeah.
And we all have that. I think most people have that feeling, and that's where our Creative Coven, our mastermind, we're there for each other. And one of the lessons I learned from an author in my group that I admire so much, she said, Karen, writing is building something. Editorial revising is ripping it apart. It's demolishing it. And while I love the editorial process, the revision process, they're two very different things. And that for me, mindset wise, has been a challenge. It hits me in the same place every time, no matter what.
Well, and then in that regard, what inspires you? What keeps you going?
The knowledge that I would keep doing this whether I got paid anything ever again. I'm just a really grumpy person if I'm not writing. I take breaks. I'll take the occasional summer off, whatever that needs to be. But my husband will tell you I'm a pretty crappy person when I'm not writing. It just is, it's a part of me. And it would be lovely to be rich and famous, but the satisfying part is the writing and the revising and all of the stuff that goes with it. I love it.
Well, to me, I swear that's key. I mean, I don't know anyone who's successful at this that doesn't love to do it. Two things. I think of there's a writer who she lives in Scotland with her husband. She's a Californian here like me. Her name's Alexandra Sokolov, and she's really successful as a screenwriter and as a teacher and as a novelist. And she was talking on social media one time and about people who struggle to write. And she said, here's the thing. That's the time I get to sit down and create the world any damn way I want to. That's my motivation, right? That's the only time of the whole any day where the entire world is of my choosing. I can exclude everything else and I can create a world that I want. And that's a tremendous motivation. And I hadn't really thought about it that way.
As
when I
adults,
was
we get to play and
absolutely
have this whole imaginary world, right?
you're Lord and master of your world there, man. And I hadn't thought about it that way before. So that became a nice motivating tool. Sometimes when I don't feel like, maybe it's like I just don't feel like doing something. I'll go, oh, that's right. Let me go keep creating some stuff here. The other thing I was going to say, and this is for folks here in the States mostly, because I don't think there's any in Canada, but my friend Jonathan Mayberry many years ago started a writers similar group in Pennsylvania when he was still in Philadelphia. It's called the Writers Coffee House. And it came out of an actual critique group, and it turned out where everybody was hanging around afterward, talking and drinking coffee and talking about industry things, but not critiquing work. And so they ended up creating this group that's what the group was, to talk about, the industry and tips and things like that. Well, when he moved out to San Diego, that group continued on, and now there's similar writers coffee house groups in Los Angeles and San Francisco and San Diego, of course, and Long Beach, and I think Chicago and several other cities. I started one with Jonathan's blessing here in the Northern California area, in Sacramento area. I actually haven't been able to do anything with it, and since we moved here to Davis, so I'm literally almost 50 miles away from where we were doing it before. So I haven't started up one here because I'm too busy. But short version of all that is just, I think by whatever name you call it, the concept that you're talking about with the Creative Coven or the Writers Coffee House, for writers to just get together and support each other and share information, share tips without the critiquing part of it, I think is just a great idea, because it is a solitary endeavor. And every once in a while, it's really nice to talk to people who know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And those coffee houses you're describing, it makes me think of the literary and artistic salons of the 20s and 30s, and the Fitzgerald days. And
oh yeah, absolutely.
I wish I had been around in those days. I think that just would be so stimulating.
Yes.
Whether it's supportive all the time, I'm not sure. There was probably a lot of jealousy and stuff going on, but I love that concept.
Absolutely. Well, I only have one more question. It is my typical closing question where I really look to have fun. Hopefully it's a fun question. I always mean for it to be a fun question. And the format's always the same. I can put you together with any one of the following three people. Which one of them would you choose and why? And the options I'm going to give you are the late Princess Diana,
Okay.
the great Italian actress Sophia Loren,
Oh,
and sticking with the Italian theme, Mario Puzo, the great novelist Mario Puzo.
oh my gosh.
One of those three, I can put you together for a conversation, meal, dinner, whatever. Which one would you choose?
That is tough. I'd love to have a little piece of every one of them, but it would have to be Sophia Loren. Yeah.
Sophia Loren. Yes. Okay.
Sophia
Why?
Loren. Why?
Yeah.
I mean, all three of those people, two women and a man, are legendary, but I just have such admiration for Sophia Loren. She just seems like such a multi-dimensional woman. I love the way she has aged, with confidence and with vitality. And she's a smart, bright woman. I've loved her films. Yeah, that would be my.
She's a force. She's a force of nature.
Oh my gosh, she still is.
Yes, absolutely. Well, great choice. Karen, thank you so much. This has been a great time for me to spend, a little time talking about writing and your work. And I was thrilled to meet you in Tucson, and I'm thrilled to follow your career as a writer. And I wish you all the success in the world. And I thank you for coming on today.
Thank you. And I wish you the best in your writing. I know that you are very dedicated to that. And
I think it's called being well, I started to say a word I don't want to use. Yes, I'm almost over dedicated to it, but I will, before I leave though, I always like to say the same thing. Couple things. One, if you haven't hit subscribe, please do that, because it'll really help other people also find the show. Also, if you would go onto your podcast catcher of choice or even YouTube and leave a review, that also helps people find the show. And if it's a 5-star review, it makes my little feelers good. So, hey, that's always a good thing, right? But mostly the big thing there is it does help people find the show. And I think it's something, I like to think that what we're doing here is a really helpful thing for anybody who's interested in writing, or maybe even just a reader who wants to know how writers think. And it's a lot less expensive than going out and buying all those pricey craft books that, you find at Barnes & Noble. So never thought I'd advocate for not buying books, but I don't mean it that way. Anyway, the very last thing, aside from thanking Karen again, is the same thing I always leave you with. Tomorrow is not promised to anyone, so please make today count. I'm Rich Eisen, and this has been The Open Mic.